It's July 1961. You're walking through the campus of Yale University. You saw an ad in the local paper offering $4.50 for a study on memory and learning. It's an easy gig for an hour's work. You enter a basement room in Lindsley Chittenden Hall. You meet a stern-looking man in a gray technician's coat and another volunteer, a pleasant middle-aged accountant named Mr. Wallace. You draw slips of paper to decide who will be the teacher and who will be the learner. You get teacher. Mr. Wallace is the learner. You watch as Mr. Wallace is led into an adjacent room. He's strapped into a chair, and electrodes are attached to his wrists. The man in the gray coat tells you that these shocks will be painful, but they won't cause permanent tissue damage. Then, you're led back to your seat in front of a massive machine. It's a shock generator. It has 30 switches lined up in a neat, clinical row. On the far left, it starts at 15 volts. Slight shock. As your eyes move to the right, the numbers climb. 75 volts, 150 volts, 300 volts. Under 375, it says danger, severe shock. And at the very end, under 450 volts, there are 3 simple letters, X, X, X. Your job is simple. You read a list of word pairs to Mr. Wallace. If he gets one wrong, you flip a switch. And every time he gets one wrong, you move one step to the right. Now, imagine you're in that chair. You've just reached 150 volts. Mr. Wallace is screaming through the wall. He's shouting that his heart is starting to bother him. He's demanding to be let out. You look at the man in the gray coat. You ask if you should stop. He looks at you, face like stone, and says, "The experiment requires that you continue." What do? If you're like most people, you think you'd walk out. You think you'd never be the person to flip that 450-volt switch. But history tells a much darker story. This is the Milgram Experiment. To understand why this experiment even happened, we have to look at the world in 1961. The wounds of World War II were still raw, but more importantly, the world was watching a trial in Jerusalem. Adolf Eichmann, one of the major organizers of the Holocaust, was in the hot seat. People expected to see a monster. They expected a man with fire in his eyes and madness in his soul. Instead, they saw a bureaucrat, a man who looked like an accountant. His defense? "I was just following orders." This sent shockwaves through the psychological community. Was the Holocaust the result of a uniquely German defect, or was there something much more terrifying lurking in the human psyche? Enter Stanley Milgram, a 27-year-old assistant professor at Yale. He wanted to know if the just following orders excuse was a lie, or if ordinary people like your neighbor, your butcher, or your mailman, could be coerced into committing atrocities simply by an authority figure telling them to do so. Milgram didn't think Americans would go through with it. He actually planned to run a pilot in New Haven and then take the experiment to Germany, assuming Germans would be more obedient. He was dead wrong. The setup was a masterpiece of deception. Everything you saw as a participant was a lie. That draw for roles? Rigged. Both slips of paper said teacher. Mr. Wallace, the nice accountant, was actually an actor named James McDonough. He wasn't getting shocked at all. The machine was a prop. The only real shock ever delivered was a 45-volt sample given to you, the teacher, just to prove the machine was real. It stung. It made the threat credible. The procedure was clinical and repetitive. You would read a word like blue, followed by 4 options: sky, ink, box, lamp. Mr. Wallace would press a button to indicate his answer. At first, it's easy. He gets a few right. You feel relaxed. Then, he misses one. 15 volts. Flip. A tiny buzz. No big deal. But then he misses another. And another. By the time you hit 75 volts, you hear a grunt from the other room. At 120 volts, he shouts that the shocks are becoming painful. At 150 volts, this is the point of no return. He screams, "Experimenter, get me out of here. I refuse to go on. My heart's starting to bother me." This is where the real experiment begins. This wasn't a test of memory, it was a test of your spine. When you turned to the experimenter, the man in the gray coat, to protest, he had a script. He had 4 specific prods. Prod 1. Please continue, or Please go on. Prod 2. The experiment requires that you continue. Prod 3. It is absolutely essential that you continue. Prod 4. You have no other choice. You must go on. If the teacher asked about Mr. Wallace's health, the experimenter would simply say, "Although the shocks may be painful, there is no permanent tissue damage, so please go on." There was no physical force, no gun to your head, just a man in a lab coat telling you that you had to keep going. It gets darker when you look at how the participants actually behaved. They weren't cold-blooded killers. They weren't enjoying it. In fact, they were falling apart. Milgram described people who were sweating, trembling, stuttering, biting their lips, groaning, and digging their fingernails into their flesh. There were reports of regularly occurring fits of nervous laughter. One participant had a seizure so violent the experiment had to be stopped. They were in a state of extreme cognitive dissonance. Their eyes saw the XXX label. Their ears heard Mr. Wallace's agonizing screams. Their brains told them this was wrong. But their hands kept flipping the switches. At 300 volts, Mr. Wallace would pound on the wall. He would scream that he would no longer provide answers to the memory test. The experimenter would tell you to treat silence as a wrong answer. At 315 volts, another pound on the wall, and then silence. For the rest of the switches, 330, 345, 360, all the way to 450, there was nothing but dead silence from the other room. For all the teacher knew, Mr. Wallace was unconscious or dead. The teacher would look at the experimenter, pleading with their eyes to stop. The experimenter would just stare back. "Please continue." You'd think the experiment would end when the participant finally refused, but Milgram wanted to see how far the average person would go. He asked 40 psychiatrists before the study how many people they thought would go to the very end, the full 450 volts. The psychiatrists said maybe 1%, only the pathological ones. The actual result, 65%. 26 out of 40 ordinary men from New Haven, Connecticut, flipped every single switch, including the one labeled XXX, simply because they were told to. Not a single person stopped before 300 volts, not one. When Milgram published his findings in 1963, the world went into a tailspin. People didn't want to believe it. They attacked his ethics. They claimed he had psychologically scarred the participants. And to be fair, he had. Even though they were debriefed and shown that Mr. Wallace was fine, the participants had to live with the knowledge that, under the right circumstances, they were capable of killing a stranger. Milgram defended himself by saying the illusion was necessary to uncover a fundamental truth about human nature. He developed the Agentic State theory. He argued that when people are part of a hierarchy, they stop seeing themselves as individuals responsible for their own actions. Instead, they see themselves as agents for an authority figure. They shift the moral burden. "I didn't do it," they tell themselves. "The guy in the lab coat did. I was just the hand on the switch." The aftermath of this study changed everything. It led to the creation of institutional review boards, IRBs, and strict ethical guidelines for psychological research. You couldn't run the Milgram experiment today, at least not in its original form, but the data was clear. The German defect theory was dead. The capacity for extreme obedience wasn't a cultural fluke. It was a built-in feature of the human brain. So, what does this mean for us today? It's easy to look back at grainy footage from 1961 and think, I'm different, I'm more educated, I'm more aware. But Milgram's experiment has been replicated dozens of times across the globe, in the 70s, the 80s, and even as recently as the 2000s with slight modifications. The results are always depressingly similar. The percentage of people who go to the end rarely drops below 50%. It's a chilling reminder that the line between a good person and a participant in an atrocity isn't a wall of granite. It's a thin, fragile wire. We like to think we are the masters of our own morality. We like to think that in the moment of truth, our conscience would win. But Milgram showed us that for 2/3 of the population, the voice of authority is louder than the voice of the victim. Next time you're told to do something that feels wrong, something that makes your heart race or your palms sweat, remember Mr. Wallace. Remember the silence in that Yale basement, because the most dangerous phrase in the human language isn't a curse or a threat. It's, "I was just following orders." Thanks for watching this video. Tell me, what do you think was the most shocking fact? Let me know in the comments.